This week on Propaganda by the Seed Shorts, we're talking about the problems with permaculture, as well as spending maybe even more time talking about the implications of cross-pollination and hybridization on native plant populations. But before we do that, let's hear from our friends at the Channel Zero Podcast Network.
The Final Straw is a weekly anarchist radio show. It's fucking awesome, and you're never going to hear me say fucking awesome on our show because we're FCC regulated.
There's a black part of my heart that just flutters when you talk like that.
Talk, then more yelling.
It's a weird sort of like nice thing in a way, but also can get kind of crushing at times.
thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org.
Today's topic on Propaganda by the Seed Shorts is permaculture, especially what I think is wrong with permaculture. And before I go any further, I do want to clarify that I don't think permaculture is necessarily like evil, bad. I have been a guest teacher at permaculture design courses. I have lots of friends that I met through what was once called the Portland Permaculture Meetup, later called the Resilience Hub. Yeah, there's lots of good things about permaculture, but there's also some bad stuff to say about it. And I do think that there's enough good there, and the intention of the people doing it is usually good enough that critiquing it is maybe a way that it could get better. I'm also not against just fucking scrapping it and moving on. It's, I don't think there's anything, inherent to permaculture that you couldn't find in another area of study or rubric or whatever. So there's good, there's bad. There's certainly useful things to learn there. And plenty of bad things to say too. So let's move on to a quick definition of what permaculture is. The word itself, permaculture, is a portmanteau of permanent and agriculture. And I think it's most useful to think of it as a design system. And the design system is based on a bunch of principles that are all pretty straightforward and common sense. Things like you should observe and interact before making big changes, and you should make the smallest change for the most effect, and you should design systems that don't create waste. All, totally reasonable, and I don't know that the design system kind of falls into some of the issues that I'll talk about in a second quite as much as the sort of overall permaculture community or aesthetic or whatever, which has come to also encompass a set of practices that people think of as being like part of permaculture. Things like swales, forest gardening, sheet mulching. And if you took the design system aspect of it seriously, you might not implement these practices sort of willy-nilly or try to always use them. You would use them when they're useful in context, but unfortunately, for a lot of people, have gotten lumped together into being this one thing that we think of as permaculture. All right, so moving on to the problems. First one I'll talk about is cultural appropriation. And this mostly, I would say, applies to those permaculture practices. And cultural appropriation is a problem not only because of the moral aspect or ethical aspect of like it hurts the person you're appropriating from or the culture or community that you're appropriating from, but it also tends to strip away context along with that harm. And that makes whatever's being appropriated less useful. And I'm not saying, and I don't think would ever say that we shouldn't learn from other people or other cultures. But when that's done in a good way, it tends to not only transfer knowledge, ideas, in a way that does not harm, but also brings along context, making those ideas hopefully more useful in effect. And that has not always been the case, and is often not the case, let's say, with permaculture. Also, I think permaculture has good potential to be an accomplice or at least a good neighbor to indigenous struggles, and has not lived up to that always. Occasionally, I do see permaculture groups working with indigenous groups in a really beautiful way, and so it can happen. And I guess I'd just like to see more of that. So where that's happening, I applaud it, and where it's not, I think it would make sense to put a lot of effort into trying to build those bridges. Another issue that I see frequently with permaculture, and this is probably the one that I've seen the most in my own interactions with permaculture, is overpromising and underperforming. People who get into permaculture but haven't actually done like boots on the ground, hands in the dirt, gardening or land management or anything for any significant amount of time, tend to take away from their first interactions with permaculture this idea that you can design an ecological system that is self-regulating and requires no work and produces massive outputs and will save the world. And I have never seen anything remotely like that happen ever. Permaculture systems tend to require massive amounts of human labor to work. Like, yes, you're trying to design this ecosystem, but you are part of the ecosystem, and that takes a lot of time and effort. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Lots of people enjoy gardening, and it's often really good for you to go out and like work in the garden for a while. That's not a bad thing, but it is something that we should be taking into consideration. And permaculture systems, I have seen some that produce like a very good yield of annual vegetables, but typically they don't produce like large amounts of like commodity crops or even high calorie crops, with the possible exception of like nut production, but that's kind of still in its infancy, at least in North America, of these like integrated ecological nut production systems. So I don't think the systems that are created by permaculture are bad. And certainly my own gardening system is influenced by permaculture a lot, and it produces what I need it to. But the idea that you can build a garden by yourself that's on like an acre that's going to fully produce everything you need to live and not going to require any work is just plain wrong as far as I can tell. And if there are examples of that, I would be very interested in seeing them. The final problem that I often see with permaculture is something that I would call, and I'm pretty sure I've heard other people call, the educational industrial complex. It seems like the most common way to make a living from it, something around permaculture, is to be an educator and to sell kind of high cost permaculture design courses. And it seems like a lot of the people who are selling these courses don't have a ton of experience. The ones that I've participated in as a teacher, I thought were pretty good. And, you know, we're teaching valuable things, but I would kind of only justify the expense of those if you want to be a professional designer. So if you're doing like landscape design or something like that, those courses could be really, really useful, and make a lot of sense. But kind of for a, you know, if you just want to mess around in your own garden, I don't know that the cost is really justified. And beyond ones that I have seen firsthand, a lot of them seem like people who are presenting themselves as experts who haven't really done the thing successfully, and are just kind of teaching unproven theory. And that feels kind of gross. If you want more on this topic, you might try the Poor Prole's Almanac episode about permaculture, or episodes maybe. I'll look them up and link them in the show notes. I don't 100% agree with their take, but it's definitely thoughtful and interesting and worth a listen if you want to go deeper on this topic. This question comes from Emma on Instagram.
Hello. I am wondering about the ecological implications of cross-pollination and hybridization, specifically in regards to native plant populations. So, for instance, I work at a nursery and learned about a new redbud disease that's decimating wild populations because nursery trade cultivars have been crossing with the straight species, making the seedlings weaker and more susceptible to diseases and pests. And how do we know that this is not happening with other species? And with that idea, what are the general mechanisms behind cross-pollination and hybridization, as in what makes some species or genera more likely to cross than others, and how close is too close to worry about crossing? Is it the same or different across species and genera? And again, those that readily hybridize, how are they not just crossing all the time and seeding random hybrids everywhere, especially as more cultivars and species in general are introduced and sold through the nursery trade every year? And then I'm wondering how some popular naturally occurring hybrids like Amelanchier grandiflora, which is a cross between Amelanchier arborea and Amelanchier laevis, and just how that was discovered, identified, and now how it's isolated and replicated, and where hybrids like that kind of fit into all this cross-pollination messiness.
Thanks for sending in this question. This is probably the most complicated question I've gotten, and I love it. That said, I don't know that I will have satisfactory answers for any of it, certainly not all of it, but I'm going to do my best. And they're very interesting questions, so it'll at least make an interesting podcast bit. All right, first, what are the ecological implications of cross-pollination and hybridization, especially with native plant populations? They are numerous and largely unknown, at least to me. And I would love anything I can't answer. If you know about it and can answer it, please, please, please send me a voice note and I will put it on the next podcast. All right, first let's define some terms. Cross-pollination is just pollen being brought from one plant to another. And that could be, different individuals within the same population, or different individuals from different populations crossing, or whatever. Hybridization is a little bit more specific. Hybridization is generally defined as the offspring of two stable breeding populations. And there's lots of different kinds of hybridization, so we'll break it down a little further. In cultivated plants, you frequently have intraspecific hybrids. So they're the same species, but you've got two stable breeding populations that are crossing. So an example of that might be you have a yellow cherry tomato, and when you plant the seeds of that yellow cherry tomato, you get more yellow cherry tomatoes. So it's stable breeding. And then you have a pink slicing tomato, and when you plant the seeds of that one, you also get a pink slicing tomato. Again, stable breeding. And then when you cross them, let's say you get a yellow plum tomato. That would be an intraspecific hybrid. You can also get interspecific hybrids, meaning two different species are crossing and making a new hybrid plant. You can even get intergeneric hybrids, where you have two different genera crossing. An example of that would be the Shipova, which is a cross between a sorbus and a pyrus. So it's a cross between like a mountain ash and a pear. So plants that are even pretty distantly related can sometimes cross. All right, now what are the implications of this for native plant populations? The first one that comes to mind is potential pressure on local ecotypes. The majority of the native plant industry is often centered in the Midwest. So you can frequently buy native plants that are the species is native to the Northeast where I live, and have them be Midwest ecotype plants, just because that's like where the supplier is from. And this can put additional pressure on those local ecotype genetics, because a lot of native plants are basically losing habitat availability to all sorts of habitat destruction. And then when people are trying to maintain some of that habitat by planting native plants, it can sometimes even put additional pressure on the local populations, because you're getting these genetics that aren't from here, and might have some, minor but important differences, like maybe they grow a little bit taller, or maybe they're a little bit shorter, or maybe they bloom at a different time. So that could definitely be an issue. And where those plants are the same species, there's likely to be kind of minimal barriers to them crossing and those gene pools just getting totally mixed up, which may or may not have significant problems, but there definitely are cases where that can be ecologically damaging. And almost always is going to lead to some loss of biodiversity if the local ecotype kind of disappears from the landscape. So I would say that's an argument for trying to use local ecotype plant material whenever possible. There are also cases where the risk of cross-pollination is minimal. And one of those is some cultivar native plants, or so-called nativars. Some of the criticism of these nativar plants is that they are sterile and don't produce pollen, and therefore there's no pollen for pollinators to collect and eat and all this stuff. That does, however, prevent them from crossing with wild populations and doing some basically unwatched experiments in genetic mixing. If they're pollen sterile, there's no real risk of them, causing any weird hybridization events. Also, a lot of cultivars have been selected for weird properties, double flowers, unusual colors, and a lot of these properties or characteristics or traits are somewhat maladaptive to their plants in their natural habitat, which is kind of unlikely to cause a problem because any plant that is expressing these maladaptive traits would probably not be able to successfully breed very much. You might get a few randos out there in an untended landscape, but they will just kind of disappear because they can't reproduce very well. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. So I guess my first concern would be for loss of local ecotype genetics due to planting of non-local ecotypes, but of native species. And then there is the possibility of sort of closely related species crossing with local species, but it's, I would say, lesser likelihood of happening. And I guess that's a good segue into the next question, which is what keeps similar species from crossing and hybridizing? And there's several things. Chromosome count is a frequent one. So if two different species have different numbers of chromosomes, it doesn't 100% mean they can't cross, but it's a significant barrier. And in sort of a wild setting, it's often just like physical barriers like mountain ranges or deserts or something like that that keeps populations genetically isolated enough to keep them from mixing that creates speciation. And some other things that can prevent related species from crossing when they live in a similar environment is bloom time. Maybe, even just a week of difference in the bloom period can effectively stop species from crossing. Also, if they have a pollinator mismatch, like maybe one is pollinated by flies and one is pollinated by bees or something like that, then maybe that pollen isn't getting carried to the other species that it might otherwise cross with. But when we start moving plants around, we might inadvertently remove these physical barriers and cause some interspecific hybridization events. But they're pretty rare because usually what allowed a species to develop into its own species and not just constantly cross with closely related populations, there's usually enough barrier to keep those from crossing. And I don't know of any specific cases where human-introduced plants have caused a new interspecific hybrid to not only develop but kind of gain a foothold and really spread. But if someone knows about a case like that, I would be very interested in hearing about it. All right, next question. How do natural hybrids form and how are they maintained in cultivation? So the example that you gave was Amelanchier grandifolia, which is a cross between Amelanchier arborea and Amelanchier laevis. And when I look at the Go Botany page for Amelanchier laevis, it lists, 4 naturally occurring hybrids. So this species naturally hybridizes with A. arborea, A. Bartramania, A. humulus, and A. sanguinea. And all of these are listed as rare. And I would guess that since these, all these species have overlapping habitats, and all are capable of possibly hybridizing, that there's kind of a dice roll involved in getting a viable hybrid seed. So maybe these, they're not constantly crossing, and then maybe only 1 in 1,000 times that they're crossing, meaning that the pollen is brought from the flower of one species to the flower of the other species. Most of the time that it's just not going to work, but maybe 1 in 1,000 you get a viable seed, and then out of 1,000 viable seeds, maybe one of them turns into a plant that actually got established, and that's like why they remain rare in nature. As far as how they're maintained in cultivation, they're almost always going to be vegetatively propagated. So Amelanchier grandiflora autumn brilliance is a fairly common cultivar, and that's vegetatively propagated. So someone either intentionally made that cross at some point. I think that's probably what happened, or potentially they found it out in the woods and it had exceptional fall color. And so they selected that either from a breeding program or from the wild as oh, this is a really cool one. I'm going to give it a cultivar name and replicate it clonally. And so you're not trying to hand do these interspecific crosses over and over again. You just got to find that plant once, and then you can just vegetatively propagate it from there. 2 final points before we call it a day. One is that there are some genera that seem to cross and hybridize very readily. An example would be Castanea, the genus of chestnuts and chinkapins. As far as I know, they all totally cross with virtually no barriers. And the natural barriers to those crosses are primarily geographic. So if we put them all in the same orchard, they tend to mix up quite easily. But there are other genera that don't cross nearly as easily. For example, persimmons can cross, but to make the initial cross between the American persimmon and the khaki or Asian persimmon took years of focused effort to figure out how to do it. So there's lots of factors into what plants can or can't cross, especially once we start talking about cross species mixing. Final point, what even constitutes a species is the topic of much debate and a kind of ongoing scientific argument. And it's somewhat comes down to an arbitrary call in many cases, which is why we often get the number of species in a genera kind of growing or shrinking depending on the latest studies. So these, especially when we're talking about interspecific hybrids, it can be real confusing about what is a hybrid, what should be named as its own species, and where to draw that line, especially as it changes over time, as many existing species that are, pretty clearly their own species came from a interspecific hybrid at some point. So, sometime in the past that species was a hybrid that formed and was able to take hold as its own population. Well, I hope that answers at least some of your questions. It probably brings up new questions. If I got anything wrong, I would be happy to hear about it and make corrections, or if anyone wants to add to this conversation. I'm certainly interested to hear from you. And if you can send corrections and such by voice note, I'll plug them right into the next episode.